Rabbi Akiva, or Akiva, I guess, at this point, was born in about 50 CE, which was a pretty crazy historical period for basically everybody, Jews and otherwise. The Roman Empire was getting up to its usual shenanigans. Nero was appointed as Caesar, and that went about as well as can be expected. Rome was nearly burnt down a few years after, and things weren't too great over in Jerusalem either. There was all sorts of corruption happening within the temple priesthood. There was a new heretical sect called the Sadducees, or the Tzaddukim as they were called then, who were denying parts of the Torah and causing all sorts of issues. There was a sizable Roman force occupying the city, with a provisional governor called a procurator appointed over Jerusalem, who naturally the Jews were none too pleased about. I go over all of this in a bit more detail in my video about the Roman siege and destruction of Jerusalem, so check that out if that sounds interesting. But as for now, the fact that matters is that it was a turbulent time. But away from all that, born to an unremarkable man named Yosef, who was possibly even a convert, was born Akiva, somewhere in the countryside of Israel. Now, unlike a lot of these stories, Akiva wasn't special. He didn't show remarkable brilliance from a young age. He wasn't particularly knowledgeable. He didn't even go to school, as to be fair, getting an education of any sort for most people in those days was pretty rare. And that was how he lived his life for several decades. He worked in the employ of a rich man, possibly a merchant of some sort, by the name of Ben Kalba as a shepherd. He was a hard worker and a good, honest man, if not a bit simple. He was, after all, illiterate, and was known for his humility and kindness. Seeing this, the daughter of his employer, a woman named Rachel, saw that he was a good man and fell in love with him. But they couldn't be married, as he was a low, ignorant peasant, and she was the daughter of a wealthy man who, according to her father, would be absolutely forbidden from marrying the likes of him. But she didn't care, and they were betrothed in secret on the condition, Rachel made Akiva promise, that one day he would go to the study halls, learn, and become a big Torah scholar. So he agreed, and they were married. Now, of course, her father, Ben Kalba found out soon after, and he was absolutely furious. He disowned his daughter, kicked her out of the house, and took a vow, which I might add were taken extremely seriously in those days, that she could never again benefit from any of his wealth and property. So the two of them were on their own. It says that in the winter they would sleep in a storehouse of straw, and Akiva would gather strands of straw from her hair and tell her that if he had the means he would replace the straw with a crown of gold. Then it says that a strange man came knocking, attributed to being, as are most mysterious men who suddenly appear in stories of the Talmud, to be the prophet Elijah, who knocked on their shed begging for a bit of straw as his wife had just given birth. Naturally, they gave what they could, but they were happy and counted themselves fortunate, as they said, "See, this man doesn't even have straw," meaning they counted themselves glad to have the little bit that they had. Which generally gives you a picture as to how they lived their life. Quiet, humbly, and peaceful. But still, time passed and he was still an illiterate, very far from anything resembling a scholar. And they were nearly old at this point, being 40 years of age. Now, Akiva wanted to learn, he really did. It's just he felt he was basically an old man at this point. He didn't know how to read. He'd basically never had an opportunity to open a book in his life before, and didn't know a word of Torah. He wasn't a young student who could be educated and learn new things. He was a farmer who lived with his wife, who was set in his ways, and he felt that that couldn't change. One day, he was walking and saw a strange sight. He was standing by a brook, and there was a rock by the edge of the water with a hole bored straight through its center. Confused, he leaned in closer and saw that it rested beneath an overhang, wherein the water above it slowly dropped single droplets of water, one at a time, onto the center of this rock. And, over the many years, the small drops of water had, over enough time, knocked a hole straight through the center of this stone. And here he had his epiphany. He was, in a sense, like this rock, old, stubborn, and set in his ways, but with enough patience and through years of time and effort and hard, diligent work, even that rock could be changed. Therefore, so too could he. So he went home, and much to the joy of his wife, decided that he was finally going to travel to the big schools of Jerusalem and become a Torah scholar. So he left his wife, and presumably at this point some of his kids, and made the long several-day journey to the city of Lud and the school of the sage Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkanas. Fortunately, he was accepted, and it was a bit of a strange situation, the school being filled with younger men and students learning advanced studies of the Jewish law and halacha, and there you have a middle-aged guy in the corner being tutored on how to read essentially the ABCs, or the alphabet if you want to be pedantic. But he didn't care, he had a mission, and much like that rock, with enough time and effort, he learned his ABCs, and then how to read and write, and then how to study. And he was persistent, and in addition, the guy who ran the school, Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkanas, took quite a liking to him, and he became his favored student. Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkanas is a whole other can of worms. There's a ton about him too, a lot of it being more supernatural. Story goes that one time he got into such an argument with some of the other sages that he had a carob tree uproot itself, a river flow backwards, and the walls of their school nearly collapsed before finally having the voice of God intervene to prove that he was right. It's a whole thing. I might do a video at some point on the Oven of Achnai, which is the event that contains this bit. It's pretty crazy and ends with Rabbi Eliezer getting mad and using laser beam vision to incinerate things, which is a surprisingly common occurrence by the rabbis in the Talmud. But the whole thing ends with Rabbi Eliezer being excommunicated, and then having Rabbi Akiva inform him of the bad news, as he was, to be fair, his favored student. Interesting situation all around, but that's how that went. Eventually, it says that after 12 years of study, he had things pretty well figured out and decided it was time to finally head home to his wife, Rachel. Story goes that he traveled back to his hometown, and as he reached his house, where he hadn't been in for over a decade, he overheard his wife arguing with someone outside. There was this guy who's only ever described as a wicked man arguing with his wife about him. The man said that she was foolish to have married him, as firstly, the old argument that she was far above his status as the daughter of a wealthy merchant, and secondly, he had left her alone for many years to go and study in some pipe dream of one day becoming a scholar. And Rachel responded to this man, not knowing that Akiva was only a few feet away, that not only was she entirely happy with him going to school for all these years, as she trusted him fully to reach his goal, but that if he were to return before them right now, she would tell him to return and continue studying even more for another 12 years. So, hearing this, Akiva decided to once again listen to his wife, left and studied for an additional 12 years in school. Now he was quite a bit more advanced, very far from the illiterate farmer who had once left his home, and studied beneath the illustrious Rabbi Yehoshua until he was finally ordained as a rabbi in his own right, and opened his own school. So, Akiva became Rabbi Akiva, and students flocked to him, astounded and impressed by his total and absolute knowledge of Torah law, and the simplicity and clarity in how he related. Soon enough, his school had grown to absolutely massive size, famously having about 24,000 students, all of which were utterly dedicated to their beloved teacher, Rabbi Akiva, who in spite of everything retained his kindness and humility. In the meantime, however, as the decades passed, things were getting worse in Jerusalem. Tensions were growing between the Romans and the Jews, and between Jews and other Jews, with the many different religious and ideological factions, and a new, far more dangerous one, the Zealots, a faction which hated the Romans with a suitably religious fervor, and would do anything to excise the cancerous Roman plague from their city, even if it resulted in all-out war. But Rabbi Akiva, for now, was far from all that, and he taught his students in peace. And finally, after all this time and all these decades later, it was time to return home. So Rabbi Akiva traveled, with all his 24,000 students accompanying him, as was the custom, back once again to his hometown. Word had reached there, however, beforehand, and the people that lived there were very excited to hear that one of the great sages of the generation was traveling to their own little town for some reason. a great sage by the name of Rabbi Akiva, they told each other in excited whispers as they prepared, no one connecting the name to the quiet, unlearned shepherd who had once lived there, no one besides, of course, Rachel. Finally, Rabbi Akiva and his entourage reached his old hometown, which must have been quite a surreal experience for him, having all these people he had known in his youth now somewhat older and eagerly awaiting to greet him and hear his words of wisdom. But the only one he cared to look for was Rachel. People had worn their finest, fanciest garments to greet the sage, but Rachel, still a poor woman, approached alone in her simple clothing. She came to present herself before Rabbi Akiva, but his students just saw a poor random woman trying desperately to approach their teacher, so they tried to block her way and fend her off. But then Rabbi Akiva saw his wife. He said, "Leave her, for both my Torah knowledge and yours are hers," meaning everything I learned and know and everything I've ever taught was only ever because of Rachel. And that's how, after all those decades, they finally reunited. In the meantime, Rachel's father was sitting in his estate, and after all these years had really begun to feel terrible about the destitution he had left his daughter and his son-in-law in. So he was thrilled to hear that a great sage and rabbi had traveled to their town, because now he could have a rabbi nullify his vow against giving money and assistance to his daughter and son-in-law. So he went before the sage, who once again he did not recognize as his own son-in-law, Akiva, and asked him to nullify a vow he had once taken against his daughter, and explained the entire situation with how she had married a poor, ignorant shepherd, much to his chagrin, and he had taken this vow, which he now regretted. So Rabbi Akiva asked him, "Did you vow this thinking that this man, Akiva, would ever become a great scholar?" And Ben Kalba Savua responded, "If I knew that he would have even learned one chapter, or one halacha, one verse of Jewish law, he wouldn't have been so harsh." So Rabbi Akiva revealed who he was, and shocked, Ben Kalba Savua knelt, apologized profusely, and also gave him and his daughter half of all of his money. In fact, besides for all his students and knowledge, Rabbi Akiva would become an extremely wealthy man, besides for the money from his father-in-law, from a few stories wherein he or those in his employ found massive treasures from sunken ships. The wife of a Roman official named Turnus Rufus converted and donated her money to him, along with a few others. So perhaps Rabbi Akiva finally was able to buy his wife that crown of gold he promised her when they were young, as they lay in a shed and he picked straw out of her hair. In addition, they had some children, particularly a daughter who, similarly to her mother, fell in love with a simple, ignorant man by the name of Ben Azai and wanted to marry him so long as he, too, traveled and became a scholar like her father. Presumably her parents were much more accepting of this than her grandparents had been. It's possible that this was the same daughter about whom there was a prophecy foretold that she would be bitten by a venomous snake and killed on her wedding day, but I have a different video going through that whole thing, so I won't do it again here, but definitely check that out too if you're interested. It was at about this point that things finally fell apart over in Jerusalem. The boiling point had been reached long ago, and the kettle burst, due to a number of reasons, which once again I have a video going over them in a bit more length. Conflict had broken out between the Romans and the Jews. Jerusalem was besieged and a war had begun. But in spite of their city being surrounded and their walls being bombarded day after day, the Jews would have perhaps survived due to their enormous storehouses of food, which could last, according to sources, for 27 years. In fact, a third of all the food and supplies were being supplied by Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law, Ben Kalba Savua. But the zealots, that new fiery and violent faction, didn't want their people to hide behind their walls, so they decided to force a war and burnt down all the food storehouses, leading to mass starvation. In the end, the walls of Jerusalem were breached. The civilian population made a valiant fighting effort, but were all killed, and on the fast day of Tisha B'Av, the second temple was burnt down and destroyed. The remaining zealot fighters fled to Masada, where they committed mass suicide rather than be taken alive, and everyone else was mutilated, killed, or enslaved. The sages and students of the city of Yavne were spared, thanks to a deal between Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and the Roman general and later Emperor Vespasian, but the rest had to flee and hide. As if things couldn't get worse, there was a plague then, which wiped out nearly all of Rabbi Akiva's students, all but 5 in fact. The reason why is attributed to the fact that they fought and didn't have respect towards one another, which more broadly is the same reason attributed to the destruction and desolation of Jerusalem in the first place. In fact, just historically, had the sects of Jews within Jerusalem not fought between each other and joined forces against the Romans instead of undercutting each other at every turn, things most probably would have ended differently. Still, a mass plague broke out and killed all 24,000 of his students, save for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who has his whole story later on, and 4 others of prominence, and the date of the ending of this plague is celebrated as a holiday to this day called Lag BaOmer, in addition being the date of the passing of that sage, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. In addition, Rabbi Akiva had 2 sons, both of whom tragically died on the same day. Rachel, too, died at some point around here, and he buried her in Tiberia. Everything had changed so fast, and now for Rabbi Akiva, who was well and truly an old man, there was nothing left. Or was there? There was one final desperate hope. A man by the name of Shimon, who was called Bar Kokhbah, son of the star. He was a rebel, a charismatic leader who inspired and reorganized the remaining beleaguered, desperate, and scattered Jewish soldiers into a semblance of a military force. Story goes that to join his forces, you had to prove your strength by either cutting off one of your fingers or uprooting a cedar tree with your bare hands while on horseback. And despite everything, somehow they were winning. He was a large, tremendously strong, inspiring man, and there was the religious angle too, as soon after the destruction of the temple, people thought he was the Messiah, and like many others, so did Rabbi Akiva. It was desperation, and Rabbi Akiva was told by another sage, Rabbi Yochanan ben Tarta, that grass would grow from the jaws of his skull before this prophesied descendant of David arrived. The man was right, of course. Due to their smaller forces, Bar Kokhbah engaged in guerrilla warfare, ambushing smaller encampments, using the terrain to their advantage, cutting off supply lines, ambushing troops, that kind of thing. In fact, as stated, things were going pretty well, actually. They had been running their little rebel forces for a few years, and had carved out a little slot of land in Judea, with Bar Kokhbah, of course, ruling it. But this man, Bar Kokhbah, grew haughty. At one point, a man blessed him that God should assist him in his battles, and he responded that God should neither help nor hinder him. He had been advised by his uncle, a sage by the name of Rabbi Eliezer Hamudai, but they began coming into conflict. The Roman forces were bearing down on them, as ordered by their new emperor, Hadrian, so they had retreated from their strongholds and all regrouped to the fortress of Betar, which was surrounded by a large field. The Roman forces approached, and it looked like this would be the deciding battle. If they won, they could reorganize, recuperate, and strike back with refound vigor. If they lost, then they would all be annihilated. Tensions rose, particularly between Bar Kokhbah and his uncle, until it culminated in Bar Kokhbah accusing his uncle of being a spy, as arranged by an actual spy on the side of the Romans. They yelled at each other, and Bar Kokhbah shoved his elderly uncle, who fell, broke his neck, and died. It said that a voice from heaven rang out and declared, "Woe to the shepherd of the idol, who has abandoned his flock, a sword on his forearm and on his right eye," quoting a verse from Zechariah. "You have broken the forearm of Israel and blinded her right eye. Therefore the forearm of that man," in reference to Bar Kokhbah, "shall wither, and his right eye shall be struck." The Battle of Betar began shortly after, and it was a massacre. The fortress was breached, and the armies spilled out onto the field. The rebels fought with all that they had left in them, but there was just too many Roman forces. It said that the Romans went on killing until their horses were submerged in blood to their nostrils. It wasn't a glorious fight or a well-won victory. It was short and messy and violent. It was on the same day as the destruction of the temple, on Tisha B'Av. Bar Kokhbah was killed during the fighting, and it said that when his body was brought before Hadrian, they found a snake curled around his neck. Hadrian declared, had his God not killed him, who would have been able to do so? It was decreed that the dead would remain unburied, and the dead soldiers lay splayed across the field for many more years after, although it does say elsewhere that miraculously none of them decayed. In addition, Hadrian had a large vineyard, which he built a wall around using the bodies of the dead, and used their blood as fertilizer for his grapes for 7 years. And that's how the Bar Kokhbah Revolt ended. Rabbi Akiva, in the meanwhile, was captured along with many others, and Hadrian decided to set an example. So he took 10 of the greatest sages of that age, and before a large crowd, including their remaining students, publicly executed all of them in individually brutal manners. A mock trial of sorts was held beforehand, presided over by the governor, Turnus Rufus, where it was ruled that these 10 must be killed as recompense for the 10 sons of Yaakov who sold their brother Joseph into slavery. The first to be killed was the sage Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who was beheaded. The second sage, Yishmael ben Elisha, the high priest, held his head and wept. And the Roman ruler's daughter noticed that Rabbi Yishmael was very handsome and asked to have him spared. Her request was refused, of course, so she settled for having his face flayed off so she could have it stuffed. When they removed the piece of skin on his forehead, where the tefillin are placed during prayer, he cried out and died. Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion was killed by being wrapped in a Torah scroll, covered with wet rags, and lit on fire. And Rabbi Akiva was killed by having his flesh shredded off with iron combs. As he died, he said the Shema, as is the custom, and then he passed. The other sages were killed too, and that was that. The whole story is actually read as part of the Yom Kippur service, so that's somewhat relevant, as Yom Kippur is in like a week and a half from when I post this. Anyways, the rest is old history. The Jews were scattered and exiled from nation to nation, and that's how things went until recent times, but that was about that for Rabbi Akiva. In a sense, he would have the last laugh. The Romans would slowly be corrupted and all but destroyed, and despite their and others' best efforts, the Jewish people would survive and persist across the generations to this day. One of the last things Rabbi Akiva taught as he walked through the ruins of the Temple Mount years after its destruction with some of his fellow sages was of the prophecy from the Torah about the coming of Mashiach one day, and although Bar Kokhbah didn't turn out as had hoped, it would only have to be at some later date. As mentioned at the beginning, it's a bit of a sad, perhaps even tragic ending, but in spite of how things ended while he was alive, he was a truly great man, a shining beacon of inspiration towards those in his time, and even until this very day.